Today, on episode 33 of the Fit Stoic podcast, make better decisions with the third person perspective. We'll look at why it's easier to solve other people's problems as opposed to our own, and how to determine the simple, obvious, direct action when we are faced with a challenge. All right, welcome to the show. I'm Corey Samuelson. Today, I will be reading chapter 26 of the Gymchiridion. If you're new to the show, the Gymchiridion is my take on what if Epictetus, my favorite Stoic philosopher, had been a fitness trainer. And I modeled the Gymchiridion off Epictetus's talks that are collected in the Enchiridion. Today, it is chapter 26, the third person perspective. Begin quote. Be objective in looking at your own life. The third person perspective leads to better decisions and a life of greater equanimity. It's advantageous to think about your own life as if you could observe it from the eyes of another. Ever notice how straightforward and clear your advice is to your friends or those you barely know? Solving other people's problems is easy. When it comes to considering your own life, however, it's complicated. Suddenly, the elementary challenge is fraught with possibilities and ramifications that preclude the simple, obvious, direct action as an option. Don't allow that it's your life to complicate your thinking. If this were happening to someone else in the same circumstances, what would I suggest? If it's well reasoned for another, the reasoning will be sound for yourself. If someone else was wanting a healthy supper and had this menu before them, what would I have them order? If a friend was missing their workouts, as I'm missing mine, what would I have them do? Treat yourself as if you are your own dear friend. When you do, ensure you come from a place of caring. Be objective and follow through on your well-reasoned conclusions. End quote. Okay, first things first. The difference between first, second, and third person. So first person is when you think I or me. So you're thinking about your own experience from your own perspective. That's the first person. Second person would be where you are speaking to somebody else and you're saying you should or you could. So you're talking to someone directly across from you, for example. Kind of like I'm talking to you right now. If I were to think about your perspective as you are watching or listening, then I'm taking that second person perspective. Third person, you can think of it this way. You would think as he, she, or they. So you're even more removed from their experience. So the question is, what's the utility of removing yourself from your own life and taking that third person perspective? When we think about our own life, we are very much into not only what we do physically, but what we're doing mentally. So we're aware of our intentions, our desires, our fears, doubts that we may have, options that we are aware of. So it gets very convoluted. When we remove ourselves and put ourselves into that third person perspective, then we gain some distance from everything that's going on inside our head. And that is where the utility or the effectiveness of taking that third person perspective comes in. When we consider someone else's circumstances, we aren't aware of their subjective experience. We don't know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they perhaps secretly desire, what they may not even be aware that they want to achieve in the end. We can be much more objective when we are thinking about another person and what to us seems like, well, it's obvious what they should do or what they could do. Does that make the advice that we may have for someone else good advice? Wise advice? Not necessarily. The difference here, though, and why taking the third person perspective is so useful, is that very often it is a much more actionable advice, meaning it's something that can actually be done as opposed to, let's just think about it some more. It's what I call the soda of the situation, SODA, the simple, obvious, direct action. Let's get out of the abstract and think about practical things here. So let's imagine that somebody wants to exercise and currently they don't. So they want to get fitter, they want to breathe easier when they're climbing the stairs, they want to look a little bit better when they look at themselves in the mirror when they get up in the morning. We'll keep the goals very general here. In that scenario, what are some things they could do? Well, the obvious one is they could start to exercise. If someone is reluctant or has a challenge, it's generally not the circumstances themselves, it's how they think about the circumstances. So there are all kinds of objections to setting aside time to exercise. It's like, well, I don't have time. I'm completely busy. From the moment I get up in the morning to the moment I go to bed at night, I have zero time. I'm busy. I've got kids, whatever the excuses are. And from a third person perspective, quite often we'll say, well, there's probably something that a person who is busy all the time is doing that isn't as useful to their life as exercise. So they're probably wasting time somehow, spending time on the internet, watching TV. There's probably something going on, right? Now, if you imagine that you are this person who claims to be super busy and there's no time and I can't exercise. Not in my life, too busy. Yet, when we are looking from the outside here now, let's remove ourselves, stop imagining that we are this person, and take that third person perspective. We're a little more likely to think, well, those are just excuses. There is probably a way to fit some kind of physical exercise into their day. How could they do it? And I think I've heard this in relation to the army or the military, where a commanding officer will say to a subordinate, you don't have to like it, you just have to do it. And this is the power of that third person perspective. We are less likely to think about how we feel or how the other person feels in relation to what needs to be done. If we take the position that exercise needs to happen, it's a must in your life, in my life, in the life of everyone. Physical activity, exercise, it must be done. Then the feelings, that subjective experience is downgraded. It becomes less important. It's like, well, you don't have to like it, you just have to do it. It's like you must eat predominantly healthy food. If it's predominantly unhealthy, then the knock-on effect, the ramifications of that is poor health and declining health. So the act of choosing and eating predominantly healthy food, that must be done. It's like, well, you don't have to like it, but you have to do that. This is the way of reality. If you want X, then you must Y. Now, there are options to what Y can be. So there's more than one way to get something done. In other words, when you take that third person perspective, let's go back to the example of I'm way too busy, I can't fit exercise into my life. If we take that perspective of, well, you must fit exercise into your life, otherwise your body is going to start to decline. The health of your brain is going to start to decline. When we put a priority on it, then it must be done. So how can it be done? Well, maybe I could do something while I'm waiting for the toast, right? Instead of just put the toast down and it's like, oh, okay, now I'll just wait for that minute and a half or 2 minutes or whatever it happens to be. Something could be done there. And that seems simple and obvious. And that's the point. The third person perspective, we get outside of the subjective experience of the feelings that we have about our necessary behaviors to reach specific goals. And we become more objective. We become more, some would say, more hard-nosed, a little bit callous to just going with our feelings. Feelings are fine. Emotions are a reflection of what we're thinking. But that is the point of changing your thinking perspective. It changes how you interpret your circumstances. I've got a couple of quotes from a book that was written in 1916 by a gentleman named Robert R. Updegraff. And the book is called Obvious Atoms. I stumbled across this book years ago. I think I was living in Medicine Hat at the time. It's a really short book, and it's stuck in my mind ever since, and it's shaped my thinking on this third person perspective and the simple, obvious, direct action. So in this first quote, the character, Obvious Atoms, and he earned that nickname because of his approach to life and challenges, is speaking to a potential employer. Begin quote. Well, Mr. Oswald, I have decided that I want to get into the advertising business and that I want to work for you. And I thought the obvious thing to do was to come and tell you so. You don't seem to think I could make good, and so I will have to set out to find some way to prove it to you. I don't know just how I can do it, but I'll call you again when I've found out. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. End quote. You can hear in this first quote that he tells the person who has turned him down in this position, Mr. Oswald, that, well, I wanted to work for you, and it seemed the obvious thing to do was to tell you that I want to work for you. Now imagine how some people would approach this. Well, I want to work for this guy, but I actually don't know anything about advertising. I've never been in that field, so I probably should go to school. Delaying that obvious first step of going directly to the person who you want to work for in this situation and saying, I'd like to work for you. Because even in the likely scenario that the boss here is going to say, listen, you don't have the experience, you have never been in this field, you need to, and then he would actually help you, potentially, right? There was a possibility here that Mr. Oswald would have hired him. That didn't happen, but he, Obvious Atoms, decided that's okay. I'm going to figure out a way that I will make myself worthy of being hired. As it turns out, Obvious Adams, the main character here, is hired the very next day. And here's why. The boss thinks to himself, and I'm just going to read a quote here in a second, that he is impressed for a particular reason. Begin quote. How many of us have sense enough to see and do the obvious thing? And how many of us have persistency enough in following out our ideas of what is obvious? End quote. In this story, Obvious Adams, the main character ends up working in the field that he wants to work in simply because he did take the simple, obvious, direct action. Well, I want to work for this Mr. Oswald. I want to work in this field for this gentleman, and I'm going to go tell him that that is what I would like to do. And the boss, in this case, thinks, actually, I would like to have somebody like that around, because how many people think like that instead of postponing the obvious action? So back to the exercise example. Well, I don't have time to exercise. Well, what's the simple, obvious, direct action if I wanted to make exercise a part of my life and I don't have the time? Well, what if somebody else were in that situation? What would I say to them? And then you would think there probably is something that you're doing that you don't need to do, that actually has less priority than getting exercise in. If somebody else told me they didn't have time to exercise and that they were just too busy, what would I tell them? How could they make it work even if they think they are too busy, that there is no possible way? What would I tell them? When you're faced with a challenge that you think, well, I don't know what to do here, when you're really so much in your head about it, take 2 steps back. So take that, not the second person, but that third person perspective, and look at it from outside. So get out of your head, look at the circumstances themselves, the facts, the reality of the situation, and be more objective in approaching those challenges and thinking about those challenges. And if you do that, you will quite often see the simple, obvious, direct action. So in the case of a job, it's go and apply, whether you have the experience or not, because you will learn, perhaps, from the person hiring you, well, these are the steps you need to take. And again, they don't think about your life. They're just going to say, you need to get this education, you need to go and get this experience, whatever it happens to be. And in those circumstances, that term tough love can apply here. And sometimes, not that they're coming from that perspective in the military, but it's that same, you come to the same conclusion. You don't have to like it. You just have to do it. And why does that apply when you care for somebody deeply? It's because you know that regardless of how they feel about what needs to be done, it still needs to be done. And they will be better for it. When you can take that perspective on your own life, you're going to be much more effective in deciding, in choosing the actions that are simple, obvious, direct, and that will actually move you toward the excellence that you want to not just imagine anymore, but actually live. Thanks for listening. That's the end of another one. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone that you believe might like it too. This is Corey. Whatever your challenge, operate with excellence.